Hello friends, I'm Emily, aka Drawn in the Fog, and today I'm going to be making some autumn decorations. Hello friends, I'm filming this on the 7th of September. Last week everyone was feeling big autumn and fall vibes, so I decided to do my prep for Halloween video. However, then the weather has turned and we're currently mid-heat wave. It is nearly 30 degrees in my studio. I'm very warm, but I am sticking with the theme and insisting on drinking tea from my new skull mug, just because I'm that British apparently. So I've got a few bits and pieces that I've been gathering to turn my studio into a bit of a Halloween haven. The first thing I have is this little wooden pumpkin from The Works. I got it on sale last year for £2 and I have yet to do anything with it. I'm still not sure what I want to do, so I'm going to start with a layer of primer or gesso and see where the mood takes me. I've also spotted these cute little pumpkins in the Poundland. They cost £2 despite being from the Poundland. They look like they should be fairly easy to paint on. It's quite a matte surface, but I'll probably chuck on a layer of primer for that as well. I'm tempted to leave the top silver because they're cute. I have 3 of these and they're very heavy, which is quite pleasing to hold, and I've been using them as paperweights up to this point. And then the final thing I have isn't here. Ooh. The final thing I have is this little glass. It was a tealight holder. When I bought it for a few pounds this summer, it had a little wire handle on it, which I got rid of because I didn't like it. I used it in my wedding as one of the candle holders because we had lots of different jars and little glass containers. And my plan is, it reminds me of a cauldron. So I'm thinking maybe spray paint it black inside, figure out a way to fill it, and then have little polymer clay tentacles coming out of it and maybe a little cauldron stand or something like that. Honestly, if this turns out well, I'll probably keep it up all year round, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm starting with this Winsor and Newton primer. I got this huge tub several years ago and I really haven't made a dent on it. I gave the wooden pumpkin several coats of primer on the front and the base. My studio buddy Echo wanted to say hello. You could go. I decided to paint a gradient effect, starting with a very dark purple on the bottom and adding a little bit of white as I worked up the pumpkin. I'm using just some cheap acrylic paints, some Winsor and Newton, I think it's called Galleria, some Reeves. And again, of course, I'm being supervised by Echo, making sure I'm doing everything right. It was quite old and thick and dry, so it was a little bit difficult to work with. But I like the colour it becomes as I'm adding more white to it. And then after cleaning and drying my brush, I've just gone over lightly to try and blend each of the layers in. Unfortunately, it dragged quite a bit of the darker up, which I hadn't really intended. I do quite like the stripy effect, but it wasn't really what I wanted for this piece. So I tried adding in more lighter paint, but it wasn't quite what I wanted. I also realised, despite being quite thick, the first coat had patches of the primer still showing through. So on the second coat I used a different purple, which was a tiny bit lighter and a little bit easier to work with. I did the same thing again, lightening it up with more white acrylic as I painted towards the top. And then once again with a clean, partially dried brush, I just lightly brushed over it to blend the layers to make the gradient a bit smoother. It was a bit tricky in places because the paint had dried quite quickly, but I'm really happy with the overall effect.
I then used an orange Posca pen to paint the stalk and some vines growing down from the top to add some interest. In the end, I didn't feel like this orange worked very well with the purple, so I actually go in later with a gold pen and go over it. I also painted the stand black and then ended up taping off all of the painted parts to be able to paint black in between each of the slats as well. So moving on to the three little pumpkins. These were already fairly matte and probably would have been able to paint straight on them, but I gave them a couple of layers each of primer. I went straight in with the first one with more of the purple paint I'd used first time round on the wooden pumpkin. Despite being quite thick, it still turned out very patchy, so I think I ended up doing 3 or even 4 layers on this one. I usually like things that I make to have a matte finish, but this purple paint turned out super glossy and I actually really liked it. Painting up to the stalk was quite difficult because the silver doesn't actually extend all of the way to the point where the stalk meets the rest of the pumpkin. What I ended up doing in the end was actually taping off the areas that I'd painted and spray painting the stalk. The only metallic spray paint I have is gold, so I decided to go with gold stalks for these, and then they matched the wooden pumpkin a bit better too. It turns out I don't have any orange in my cheap acrylic stash. I do have some yellow and red paints that I was hoping to mix. The bottle you can see in the background is a Culture Hustle paint. I really love it. It's quite liquidy and I think it smells kind of bananas. Unfortunately, I couldn't get into it. The top has crusted with dried paint. I even tried using my jar opener because sometimes I find it quite hard to open things like bottles and jars, but this thing was not budging. So I started off using this Posca pen, which was giving me really good coverage, but there is definitely not enough paint in that pen to do 2 coats on this one and what I then do on the next one. So at this point I was ordering some purple paint to be delivered tomorrow to try and get these finished. At this point, while I'm waiting for the orange paint to be delivered, I'm going back in over the purple pumpkin to give it several more layers. The second one you'll see is purple and orange stripes. And then when the orange paint's delivered, I'll go to the third pumpkin and paint that entirely in orange. Trying to get the lines crisp on this second pumpkin was really hard, especially as oranges, like yellows, tend to be fairly transparent, so getting a little bit of purple on the orange paint then meant it was very, very difficult to cover it back up. So I'm using, I think it's called a dagger brush, where it's kind of on a slant. I found the pointed tip of it really helpful for getting into the kind of crevice between the segments of the pumpkin. So this is the next day now and my orange paint has arrived. This was Liquitex Basics, I think. I was actually quite disappointed. The orange is a really lovely colour, but it's very, very transparent. It doesn't show up really well on this video, but it's coming out really streaky, and a bit like the purple, I had to do quite a few coats on this to get it to an even colour all over. But what worked really well was putting the orange Liquitex paints over the orange Posca. The colours just worked really well, and I think it only needed 1 coat of the Liquitex paint because the Posca was doing such a good job as a background colour. So this is obviously sped up. This is many, many hours of sat doing layer after layer of purple and orange paints. So my plan at this point is to do orange dots all over the purple pumpkin. Because orange tends to be such a transparent colour, I decided to go in with a Posca pen, with a white Posca pen first, almost as like a primer underneath it, so that it would show up better. It turned out that I think the orange Posca pen is opaque enough that I probably didn't need to do this, but it didn't take a huge amount of time to do the white and then the orange, and I'm really happy with how this turned out. I tried to cluster the spots closely together at the top and then to distribute them further apart as it went down. And then on the orange pumpkin, I used my purple Posca to do a row of purple spots down each of the segments of the pumpkin. The purple was slightly off from the one I'd used on the other pumpkins. It was lighter, and this pumpkin definitely turned out more matte than the others. I think if I get some gloss varnish in the future, I'll probably go back and cover over all three of these so they match a little bit better. I'm actually working in the kitchen for most of this so that I can have access to the oven for the next thing that I do. And Echo spent quite a lot of time sitting on the chair watching me. I think at this point it was nearly her dinner time and she'd had enough and was definitely wanting me to go upstairs and feed her. So now moving on to the third piece. This is the little tea light that I'm hoping to turn into a template. You can see there the original that I bought was about £1.50 from Flying Tiger. So I didn't have any black spray paint. I have this, I think it's Payne's Grey in Liquitex Acrylic spray paint. This is the first time I've used it and it went everywhere. You can only see a small amount of it in this footage, but it's gone on my desk, on my iPad. It just kind of pooled underneath the bit that you press. It went everywhere. On my second go of spraying this, it was just like so much liquid within the little glass jar. I don't know if it's to do with what I'm spraying. Maybe I was spraying too close to it. I really don't know. So what I ended up doing is using the paint within the glass jar to kind of cover all of the insides using my finger. Once it's dried, it had cracked a little bit in the bottom, and because I'm going to be packing it out with foil, I was really worried about it scratching off the glass. So I did a layer of PVA glue just as a kind of an added protection there. So for the tentacles, I'm using Fimo Soft in purple, orange and yellow. I started off making the base. I wanted it to be a little bit lighter than the orange that I'm going to use on the tentacles, so I spent quite a long time mixing the orange and yellow. This was really hard, even though it's soft Fimo. My hands really aren't strong enough to be doing this easily. I have definitely done my physio for today, trying to mush this together and warm it up. So the first part of the base is creating a ring that will support the legs and be the area that the cauldron sits on. I'd originally planned to attach the legs that would also go up as kind of prongs to hold the cauldron in place. I thought I was going to be able to do this all in one go, and then I ended up splitting it up. So I baked the ring first, and then here I'm making the little feet and gluing them on. I didn't have any liquid Fimo, so I borrowed some Sculpey glue from my friend Harry-Ann, which turned out absolutely fine, mixing the two brands. So I just glued the feet on and smoothed it down with, I've got some silicone tipped, almost like paintbrushes, but it's silicone, and they worked really well for kind of smoothing it down. And then I just did the rest with my fingers to smooth it onto the ring, and having that hard surface to smooth it onto worked really well. I then baked it again, and while that's in the oven, I started making the base for the tentacles. So I wanted a really, really thin circle about the size of the cauldron top so that it can sit just inside the cauldron. I haven't made anything like this before, so honestly at this point I was just winging it and hoping I'd be able to figure out how to attach it to the cauldron once I got to that point. I baked this on a little piece of foil which helped keep it flat and not stick to the baking tray, because I was quite worried about it warping because it's so thin. And while that's baking, I moved on to the tentacles, so I made 3 long cone shapes. I don't want them too thin at the top, so there I'm just making the tips a bit thicker. And I knew I wanted them to be different slices to add some interest. This one was really tricky to roll because the base kept wriggling all over the place while I was trying to make the tip. When I put them together, I realised I probably should have used some kind of wire structure to hold them in shape. The smaller 2 were okay, but the third one definitely just wanted to kind of flop onto the table, so I added a curl into it so it was kind of holding itself up. Now back to the base. I'm adding the prong to hold the cauldron in place. Again, making little cones. Just like with the feet, I'm using the Sculpey glue to attach it to the rest of the base and then smoothing it down. What I hadn't accounted for was that the ring was the correct size for the base, and adding the prongs on meant the cauldron could no longer sit on the ring. So once I've smoothed these all in place, I try it out and realise it doesn't fit anymore. So I have to kind of smoosh them all to the side a bit to widen it back up again. And then once more, this goes into the oven to bake for a final time. And then once the tentacles are attached to the base, I baked them. So here you're seeing me putting on the suckers in orange onto the tentacles which have already been baked, which I'm really glad I did because I needed that firmness to push the suckers against. Really happy with how this one turned out. Once this had been baked, I'd filled the cauldron with foil, and then the circle of purple was actually quite bendable while it was still warm, so I was able to kind of push that into the cauldron and pop it under the rim. After all that work making the base to be marginally lighter than the oranges of the suckers, I actually went back in and spray painting them gold as well, like I did with the stalks of the little pumpkins, because I thought that looked more authentic as a base, and also it pulled all three of them together, so all three of them have gold highlights here and there. So that's it for me today. I'm really happy with how all of these turned out. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the final reveal.